So, I've been spending the last 3-4 weeks, as you can imagine, as we get closer to our IPO date, meeting with lots of investors. So I'm actually very happy to be here. It's much nicer to be presenting to a number of fresh and eager faces than to small groups of investors who are just worrying about what the stock market is doing. So today we're going to tell you a little bit more about business development. We're going to be covering a number of different topics over the course of the next 3 hours. It'll be myself and my colleague Zhao who will be taking you through these materials. Now, if at any point over the next few hours you have any questions, please feel free just to let me know. I'd far rather be answering things that you're wondering about than just going through the slides. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about deal term structures, about licensing deals, how we structure them, some of the key terms to watch out for. Then I'll hand over to Zhao, who will talk a bit about valuation, building on some of the other materials you may have seen this morning. We'll have a break at 3:20, come back and do some work on forecasting and market analysis, and finally a short session on once we figured out how we actually do all the numbers, how do we actually communicate it? How do we present it? How do we make our pitch? And these sorts of skills are useful not just for business development, but in any walk of life where you're trying to present or communicate your ideas. So I won't go through these bios. You've heard a little bit about myself and Zhao, and you can read them for yourself. But let me jump into the main body and let's start talking about these deals. Now, the reason that our industry is particularly complicated when it comes to sort of deals between companies is, if I'm selling a mobile phone, then you'll buy it from me. I'll sell it to you for $1,000 if it's an iPhone. You'll pay me $1,000 cash, and that's it. That's the end of it. The problem in our industry is maybe I've got a drug that's gone part way through development. Maybe it's only at phase 2, and I want to sell it to somebody else. But at that stage, there's still quite a significant degree of risk. This drug may not make it to market. And someone who wants to buy the drug from me is not just going to give me $1 million, outright and then walk away. They're going to want to share some of the risk with me. They're going to say, look, I'll give you some of the money today. I'll give you, $100,000 today. But the other $900,000, you're going to have to wait until that drug has progressed, it's gone through development, and maybe eventually has been commercialized. And this idea of sharing risk during the transaction is what makes licensing particularly complicated. So when we look at licensing deals between companies, typically there are 3 sorts of payments or exchanges that will be made. There'll be the upfront payment, the initial payment that someone pays to me to buy my drug. There'll be the milestone payments paid at certain key events, particularly as the drug becomes de-risked. And then royalties. These are typically a percentage of sales when the drug finally hits the market. Now, milestones, just to think about these, typically you look at what are the risky events that during my development process, how do I lower the risk or increase the probability of success? And typically this will be on the success of various clinical development phases, so end of phase 2, end of phase 3. It could be on launch of the product. But just because you've launched the product doesn't mean all the risk has gone away. You still have commercial risk. And by that I mean, what if you can't get a good price for your drug? What if hospitals won't list your drug? What if it doesn't get reimbursed? What if it doesn't get on the National Health Insurance list? So often there are milestones on things like reimbursement, and then milestones on sales, maybe annual sales reaching a certain target, or maybe cumulative sales reaching a certain target. Royalties, as I mentioned, normally paid as a percentage of sales, typically are tiered. In other words, there'll be different percentage levels depending on just how high your sales are. If I'm selling the drug and we're doing $100 million of sales a year, which to be honest for a drug globally is not very much, I don't want to give much of that away. So maybe the royalty rate is going to be quite low. But if eventually I can sell $500 million or $600 million of the drug, I don't mind giving a higher percentage. So you'll see different percentages depending on the level of sales. And just one note here at the bottom about transfer prices. So the whole concept of royalties is based on a percentage of sales. Another way of doing it, and we'll look at a few other deal structures later, is where when I sell the drug, I actually carry on making it, manufacturing it myself. And in the future, you'll actually have to buy it from me. When we do it that way around, we can actually absorb the royalty into the price that you pay for the drug. So let me give you a real example of a deal, just to put some of these sorts of terms into context. So this is just one case study that we pulled from the public domain. It was a deal between two companies, a company called Nogra Pharmaceuticals that had a drug called GED 301. Celgene acquired the rights to develop and commercialize this drug. And the drug was just finishing phase 2. So Nogra had worked on this drug up until the end of phase 2. Then in April 2014, signed a deal with Celgene, who took on board responsibility for phase 3, regulatory filings, and ultimately launched. In this deal, they of course, they don't disclose all the details or the breakdown. We've made a few assumptions here. But we do know that Celgene paid on April 2014, $700 million US dollars to acquire the rights of the drug. But that was just the upfront payment. There were more payments to come. There were milestones totaling $800 million. And this is just a rough idea of how it could have been broken down. End of phase 3, $100 million will have been paid from Celgene to Nogra. Once the drug was launched, another $100 million. A second indication, in other words, a different disease, unleashing more value in the drug, another $100 million, launching in Europe. And then these sales milestones reaching 1 billion of sales and 2 billion of sales. And then you get these royalties, tiered royalties. When annual sales are below 500 million, then Celgene will pay to Nogra 25%. When sales go up, but still below 1 billion, maybe 30% and up to 35%. So these are, you'll hear this referred to as tiered milestones up to 35%. Now, of course, these are pretty big numbers, and later on in Zhao's section, he's going to give you a sense of what sort of numbers you'll typically see for licensing deals at different stages and in different disease areas. So a few things to bear in mind when you think about out-licensing a drug. Now, the good thing about out-licensing a drug, or selling the commercial rights to my drug, is that I can generate revenues. The upfront, of course, is my immediate revenues. Then you get milestones, and then eventually you can get royalties on sales a long time in the future. If I choose not to out-license my drug, I'm going to have to develop it myself, maybe launch it one day myself. It's going to be a lot longer before I start seeing revenues. Now, the problem, though, with out-licensing is when you out-license a drug, you actually give away a lot of value. Now, a lot of people think that it is a good business model to develop drugs up until a certain stage, up until phase 1, phase 2, and then out-license global rights. There is not a single US-listed biotech company that has that business model. And that's because when you out-license a drug, if I've been developing this great drug, got it to phase 2, decide to license it to Pfizer or AstraZeneca, I'm giving away approximately 2/3 of the value of that drug to the company that buys it, to the company that licenses it. And in the US, investors understand that, and they think, we don't want you to give away all your value. If we like your drug that you're developing, we want you to carry on building value in it yourself. So US biotech companies, European biotech companies, you'll see them all retaining rights themselves to commercialize in certain countries. Typically a US biotech, they may out-license the rights in some countries, like Japan or China, where they have no intention of developing or commercializing themselves, but they'll retain the US. And that's very important to bear in mind. Out-licensing is good, it generates revenues, but you give away a lot of value when you do it. So the key is to find the right balance. So when we come to do a partnering deal, we have sitting there with our phase 1, phase 2 molecule. We're trying to find a partner who may want to license the drug from us. How do we select the right partner? Well, we need to look at the quality of that partner, the commercial capabilities. What sort of sales force do they have? Do they have experience selling a drug like this? What's their portfolio like in this particular disease area? And what's their development capabilities like? Do they understand how to develop a drug for gastric cancer or for cardiovascular disease? We need to understand the terms. Are they meaningful? Are the numbers really going to be of benefit to me? What territories are we giving away when we do this deal? And one interesting point to note, if your drug is relatively late stage, but you've not yet secured any partners, you may want to ask yourself, well, why is that? Surely if this drug was really good, they would have at least have found some partners for this drug much earlier in development. So when you do a licensing deal, there are quite a few things besides these financial terms that you have to worry about. The scope of the licensing deal, what diseases are covered. If you're developing a drug for eye disease, it may be, if it's a VEGF inhibitor, that it could also be used in oncology. Are you giving, in the licensing deal, are you covering both disease areas? How long does the deal go on for? Licensing deals tend to be pretty long deals. 15, 20 years is typical. Development, who's responsible for development after the licensing deal is signed? Who owns any IP that might be generated? And then you come on to diligence conditions. Now, one of the problems, if I license my drug to another company, again, let's say to a Pfizer or an AstraZeneca, so they can go and commercialize it somewhere, I need to make sure that they are going to put the right amount of resource on my drug. I want to make sure that at some point in the future, AstraZeneca is not sitting with a portfolio of 20 drugs, of which mine is one that they've acquired from me, and they decide to prioritize all the other 19 drugs there. So you have these so-called diligence conditions. These will say things like, you have to put a minimum of so many dollars marketing spend on the drug. You have to put so many sales reps on the drug. Minimum requirements, and they may even include minimum sales requirements. You have to sell at least $50 million a year in these territories. Governance is important in any deal structure. This is how you maintain the relationship between the parties, how you control what's been transacted, and typically there'll be various committees that help to manage that between the two partners. And then finally, supply. Who's actually going to be making the drug? Who's manufacturing the drug? Of course, in our industry, most of the manufacturing work that we do is outsourced to contract manufacturers. But typically, one party will still hold overall manufacturing rights. So let's look at a few different deal types. So straight licensing is the easy one. It's probably the one that you're most familiar with. But there are some other deal types we should look at as well. Co-promotion, co-marketing, and then straightforward distribution. I'm not going to talk too much about distribution. Distribution is relatively straightforward. I maintain full responsibility for my drug, but when I come to commercializing or selling the drug, I need to work with distributors to get my drug to the hospital. That's quite straightforward and transactional. But the other three, let's look at it in a bit more detail. So when I do a simple licensing deal, the licensor, the owner of the IP, let's say it's ASLAN, hands over the rights for this particular brand, for this drug, to the licensee for a given territory for a certain fee, a milestone, and some royalties for a certain period of time. Now, the licensee, the company that buys the drug, is typically responsible for getting all the approvals and for continuing the ongoing development work. An important point to note is that you hear this term sales revenue being booked. Now, you have to understand, in theory, in economic theory, the most important thing is how much profit can you make. But a lot of big companies focus very much on sales as well. What's the top line sales number? It's a great headline to have. Sales has gone up 10%, but they don't tell you profitability has actually fallen off a cliff. But sales is a number that a lot of companies pay attention to. So who can, in accounting terms, claim the sales to be their own is actually quite important. In a licensing deal, the licensee, the AstraZeneca or Pfizer, they can actually write the sales on their accounting sheet. They are sales that that company has made. Now, generally, the licensee is responsible for sales, so it's AstraZeneca's field force, sales reps, marketing team, etc., who are managing to get the drug into the hospital. And as I mentioned before, it's generally quite a long-term relationship. So this is probably the most common form of transactions between a company that has a good drug and a company that wants to sell that drug. Now, co-promotion is a little bit different. Co-promotion says, okay, let's say ASLAN, my company, we want to start selling a drug, but we're a small little company. We don't have a lot of commercial muscle, so we need a bit of help. So one thing we could do is we could do a co-promotion deal. And in a co-promotion deal, we form a contract with another company who can co-promote the same drug We both promote the drug to the doctors, to the prescribers. Now, in this particular model, there's still just one brand, one drug that's being sold. And what we're essentially doing is using the co-promoter to provide some additional muscle, more sales reps, more marketing power. Here, again, importantly, we come back to this concept of sales being booked. In this case, the IP owner, the licensor, in other words, ASLAN, is still manufacturing the drug and is still ultimately selling the drug to the customers. And so in this case, sales are booked by me, by ASLAN, not by the co-promoter. Typically, these are shorter contracts than licensing, normally about 5 years. Co-promotion is pretty common with smaller companies that may not be able to do everything themselves. They may, in effect, give another company the right to sell a drug, but they may say, well, look, I want the right to sell as well and build my own commercial presence. Now, co-marketing is a little bit different. Co-marketing, we actually create a second brand. So we create another product that has exactly the same thing inside. It's the same drug, exactly the same. From a regulatory perspective, it's relatively straightforward, but you're now in the market, you've got two separate boxes with two different brand names, but it's the same thing. But one company, the IP owner, ASLAN, will be marketing one of those boxes, and another company, the co-marketer, will be selling the other boxes. So two brands, both going to customers. So again, this is about providing additional sales support for the drug. The good thing about this arrangement compared to co-promotion is you can have very different marketing activities. And often the way this is used is to try and target different parts of the population. I mean, one really interesting case study is Procter & Gamble. When Procter & Gamble first started investing significantly in China 30, 40 years ago, they did something very clever with toothpaste. They were selling, their Colgate toothpaste, a very, for China at that stage, a very premium brand, and they wanted to charge a high price. But they wanted to get the same brand out to a much bigger a much bigger population of customers. And rather than just dropping the price of Colgate, they started making a second brand with exactly the same toothpaste inside, completely identical, came out of the same factory, but on the box it had a different name. And of course, the packaging didn't look quite so fancy, but they sold that at a tenth of the price, 10% of the price of their original brand. So they had two brands in the market, but targeting very different groups of people. And drug companies will sometimes do the same thing. Not so much in developed countries, but you see a lot more in developing countries. So that just hopefully gives you a very quick, high-level view of how we structure a licensing deal. And that gives you a little bit of background to some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about in the next few sessions. And so we're going to move on to now the next stage, talking about valuation. And we're going to come back to these sort of licensing deals, some of these numbers that you saw earlier on. But now I'll hand over to Zhao.
Thank you, Carl. So for this section, we'll be talking about industry trends, driving M&A licensing, which are basically two methods of getting the same thing, an asset or a portfolio of products from a company. We'll deep dive into M&A trends and licensing trends. And after that, we'll do some valuation. So first of all, industry trends. Most drugs are developed by biotech and large pharma companies. It's extremely expensive, and it takes a very long time to run trials. Hence, the reason why they're done by companies with resources and the means to do so. The industry is facing a challenge of declining productivity and increasing costs, and they're searching for new partnership models. Now, the reason for this decline in productivity and increasing costs is because of scale. Companies are getting bigger. When you get bigger, innovation declines. You work in a big company, you are less willing to take risks. You become a bit more risk averse. And this just stifles innovation, and people are less willing to innovate. So this is why the industry is now looking for partners outside the traditional sphere of big pharma. So I was reading a very interesting report the other day from Deloitte. And this report from Deloitte, they were looking at 12 leading biopharma companies and compared their performance with smaller sized companies. And they found that these smaller companies were actually more productive than the larger companies. And moving on to the clinical development phase, it takes about 6 years of research to generate a candidate drug. You then run through a series of trials and animal tests, and you can divide these trials into roughly 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Now, this shows the different value of a drug through different phases. As you can see, we have different phases here: discovery, clinical, phase 1, and phase 2. And you can see from the graph here that the largest value creation is from phase 1 to phase 2. Now, the question you may all be asking is, why does phase 2 have so much value? So a few things. So phase 1, you focus on looking at how safe the compound is. While in phase 2, you're focusing on understanding how the compound actually works. Why is it so effective? You also identify the patients that might benefit from your compound. So this is a direct lead into how much sales you can potentially generate down the road. So it's a very important phase that you have because it's used by stakeholders who question what value the drug can actually add. So this next slide shows you success rates in development. At the bottom here, At the bottom here, 3, 5, 12, 54, and 83 are the percentages you need to achieve one approval in each different stage. As you can see, so for example, in preclinical, there's a 3% success rate of achieving approval. And as you go through each different phase, the rates of success improve. Now, the success rate for each phase is shown in red, which shows you the success of progressing through to the next phase. So you can tell that the rates are fairly dismal in terms of percentage calculated to achieve one approval. And there's a huge uplift from phase 1 to phase 2. So if you can make it through phase 2, it is quite likely that your drug might be successful. Now, what are the factors that can impact success rates? So there are numerous factors, but the main factors would be, for example, patient population and selection strategy, clinical validation of a target, and moving on to corporate-related factors, it would be, for example, factors like lack of funding and commercial decisions and how much importance people are placing in the portfolio. And this, you will see that on the next page. So why do drugs fail in the clinic? As you can tell from the pie chart here, efficacy is the largest cause of failure. And oncology is the largest oncology is the largest single therapeutic area for failure. So when drugs fail in the clinic, we need to ask ourselves, what makes a risky project? What is causing all these failures? What are the risk factors I need to be aware of? So I have discovery risks. If I don't understand how my mechanism works, it's hard for me to start clinical trials. It's hard for me to understand how my drug will be effective in patients. That's clinical risk. If it's something new, something unproven, there's a high likelihood that something might go wrong, which means I have no clinical proof of concept. There's commercial risks. I may not have IP protection. I may not be able to select my patients correctly. And it might just be a very competitive space. I might not be able to gain market share if I was to launch my drug. So I have all these risks, and how do I assess them? So a few things to remember. Drug development is a very risky process. So there's no such thing as a guaranteed success. Risk is risky. There's no guarantee of success. We have seen that drug development works in different phases. So preclinical data does not, having good preclinical data does not mean good human data. And as I was saying about novel mechanisms, they are risky, but you may have higher potential returns. So remember that we have discovery risks, development risks, commercial risks. And a lot of people focus on discovery and development risks, but they always forget about commercial risks. But commercial risks is also very, very important. It doesn't mean that you get a drug approved. It means that people will buy your drug. So just because you can get a drug approved, it doesn't mean it'll be successful. So because of all these risks, big pharma and biotech companies are looking for ways to develop drugs and share these risks. Now, most big pharma companies are seeing declines in sales. You have patent expiries on key brands, which is the patent cliff that I'm sure most of you have read about. And this is placing pressure on R&D budgets. So with limited funds and a choice of projects, what do these companies do? They focus on late-phase development projects that could launch within a short period of time to fill the gap. They tend to have a very short-term perspective. They want to generate more revenues as soon as possible, which is why they focus on late-phase development projects. But at the same time, taking this short-term view ignores the long-term value that new technologies can bring. So they may ignore all these high-quality, innovative compounds coming out from the lab. So with less resources, fewer R&D slots available, all these big pharma companies can't progress these compounds into the clinic. And a lot of these early-stage viable drugs with novel mechanisms are left on the shelf. So what's the best way forward for them? So the best way forward for them is licensing and collaborations. And in recent years, they have done exactly that. Big pharma and biotech companies have sought out licensing or other partners that can share risks for these candidates that have been left on the shelf. As you can see from this graph here, the value of licensing deals has increased over the last 20 years. And we are seeing a lot of new drug development companies in the US and EU partnering and risk sharing with big pharma. Now the question is, if you're looking at a drug or a portfolio of drugs, should you do M&A or licensing? You get the same thing in the end, but they're two very different methods. So when do you acquire and when do you in-license? So you normally acquire something, you normally do M&A if the company has a core platform that might be interesting to you. Or if the value of the company is largely driven by one single asset, which means that the company has one asset which probably makes up 90 to 100% of the value of the company. Now, on the other hand, if they have a broad portfolio of drugs, it's less likely to be acquired. Now, any acquirer doing this, they will need to justify to their shareholders and to their board why they're paying for all the drugs in the portfolio when they may only be interested in one. So now let's take a look at M&A trends and what's been going on in the market. So M&A was very slow last year. Well, I wouldn't say very slow. There was a slowdown in comparison to 2015. So on this graph here, which shows you deal values in your left and deal values across time in different years, the different colored bars here, it shows you that deal values were extremely high in 2014. 589 billion US dollars. There was a slight dip in 2015, but this declined to around US $400 billion last year. So, why were they acquiring? The economy was slow at that time. Doing M&A was a method of buying growth. Interest rates were low, which means debt was cheap. It was easier to get a loan to buy something. Smaller companies were short for cash. They were desperate to sell. And there is also the problem of declining R&D productivity, which is what I discussed a few slides ago. Now, what has happened resulting in a decline in M&A last year? We had the US presidential elections, where Clinton and Trump focused on drug pricing. I think both candidates made comments on making drug prices more affordable for consumers. So this sent drug prices down numerous times over the course of the year. You had government regulators focusing on M&A deals. Some deals were being done for tax purposes. So for example, this US $160 billion deal, Allergan and Pfizer, it was done for tax purposes, and they blocked it for regulatory reasons. Another reason is the declining stock market valuations due to global macro events. For example, Brexit, which impacted companies' ability to fund acquisitions with shares. So the recent decline in biotech, we don't see it increasing M&A in the short term. So valuations are cheap because of the decline in M&A. They are attractive, but we don't see M&A increasing for many reasons. However, three of them are increased cost of capital, which means that it's more expensive for an acquirer to purchase another company. On the other side, from the seller's point of view, they will be wondering if, I may be cheap now, but what if my value recovers later on? Why should I sell to you at a low price? And the final point is, the last 2 or 3 years have been a very good year for biotech. A lot of companies have raised money, whether it's through the private markets or the public markets. So they have a lot of cash in the bank. There's no need for them to sell to someone else to fund their operations. They have perhaps enough cash to go on for the next 3 to 5 years before this becomes a problem. So a business model, typically that used to be very popular, was serial acquisitions. So one good example was Valiant Pharmaceuticals, which saw its share price decline by 91% from July 2015 to July 2016, sorry, declined for 1 year. And previously, a common strategy employed by serial acquirers, such as Valuation, was to acquire pharma companies, which means that they'll be buying revenues, and then they'll cut costs using very cheap debt financing that you get in the market. This environment has changed. So the factors that led to the success for this strategy are no longer in place. Debt has become more expensive. And another thing is, many of these serial acquirers relied on price increases for growth. So by increasing prices, you get more revenues in, you pay off your debt, you make more money. This is now a problem because of the US presidential elections, which focus on drug pricing, as I mentioned. So the pharma industry is focusing very, very closely on what the US presidency is doing, which means that it's unlikely you will see drug prices. It's unlikely that you see very steep drug price rises in the future. So less steep drug prices, less revenues, less inability to pay off debt, which means that this business model doesn't really work anymore. So as a result, instead of acquiring companies, we expect partnering activity to continue. The big pharma, biotech companies, they still need to replenish their pipelines through other mechanisms. So there'll still be a need for licensing, though this will be at a much, much slower pace. So let's talk a bit about what we are seeing in licensing and what's been happening in the market over the last 1 year. So as I've alluded before, the environment's changed. Things are different. It was a very challenging year. Low valuations, less people wanting to fund private companies, lower M&A environment, people focusing on drug prices. Overall outlook, not so great. Deal valuations have slowed. So 92% growth 2 years ago, 53% last year. And what we're seeing now is there is a propensity for people to go earlier and provide more upfront dollars. So people are paying more upfronts, paying more in upfronts. And most of the upfront licensing deals last year involve discovery stage assets, so earlier stage assets. And these down payments were larger. So this suggests that innovation is accelerating on the sell side, and buyers feel a need to pay more for innovation. Another interesting point is that most companies were very dependent on legacy products for revenues, which reinforces the importance for licensing going forward. So just a very interesting stat here. So 2015 revenue from products approved in the last 5 years were they were worth about 12% of revenues for these companies, a very small proportion. So you see products that have been prior approved representing a smaller percentage of revenues going forward, which once again reinforces the need for these companies to carry out licensing. So 2 graphs here. The first graph, deal values over the last 12 years, from 2004 to 2016. Total deal values here on the left, showing you progression over time and growth rates. The bottom chart shows you upfront payments which is what you get once the deal is signed. Again, it shows you upfront payments over time, and the different colors represent different phases. I've also included the number of deals as well in the bottom chart. So last year, 32.1 billion US dollars worth of deals across 79 transactions. And we had a large number of preclinical deals, 29. So it's nearly half of the 79 that we're seeing on the chart here. The average phase 3 deal, the average late stage deal, was 51 million, compared to 36 million and 94 million for pre-registration and phase 2 deals respectively. So if you look at the green boxes here, average upfront payments for phase 2 deals have risen from 2004 to 2016. You can tell that the boxes are getting larger, so people are paying more and more for phase 2 upfronts over time. And looking at licensing via indications. So I've put in the top 10 indications here. Once again, the top chart, total upfront cash over 12 years for the top 10 indications. The bottom chart shows you a number of deals, once again by the top 10 indications. Now, the sum of oncology payments over the last 12 years was 2.6 billion, much higher than the second category, CNS, central nervous system. And it was the largest contributor in terms of total upfront payments for 2016 alone, around 27%. So a very large contributor from oncology. And there were 3 quite interesting deals last year as well in oncology. And just to give you a flavor of what's going on in the market. So 3 deals with upfront payments over 100 million. You had Novartis and Cencor. So this deal was for bispecific antibodies in AML and B-cell malignancies. So $150 million upfront, in addition to 2.4 billion US dollars in milestones. And the second deal was Incyte Maris for antibodies again, upfront of US 120 million, and where Incyte agreed to purchase 1.2 million shares of Maris stock at $25 a share for a total investment of 80 million. So the numbers do vary. So numbers can vary between deals as well. Now looking at average upfronts over time. So really low point in 2004, at the beginning of our data set. But if you look at 2010, 19 million, which I see as a low point, most recent low point. It has grown year on year by 15.6%. However, despite an increase in the number of transactions, average upfronts have remained fairly stable over time. So not much movement, pretty much a seller's market here. So once again, looking at average upfront by indication. So I've broken down the chart into different indications, different colors here. You have a disease average of US $28 million. The top indication was dermatology. Then we look at total deal values. And looking at the table on the right, preclinical and phase 1 deals are worth more than later stage deals. And if you look at the two charts on the left, which shows you upfronts and milestones by phase, you will see that you have higher average milestones offsetting lower upfronts. So for phase 2, for example, you had a US $45 million for phase 2. And this is very different from, I mean, it's quite different from the phase 3 upfront of 38 million. And then you look at preclinical deals being valued at similar levels to phase 2 deals. If you look at the table on the right again, with phase 1 deals being 13% higher. So the question is why are earlier stage assets being valued at the same levels as phase 2? I think the answer is, as the search for assets intensifies, the best assets will be snapped up earlier and earlier, and this drives up deal valuations. So we've talked about upfronts, we've talked about milestones, and that means we've also discussed deal values. So let's talk a bit about royalty rates. So in general, it is very hard to find data on royalties. They don't really publish them. They are considered as guarded secrets. It takes a lot of effort to find data, but from what I've gathered here, we're seeing royalty rates for phase 1 assets being higher than that for phase 2. So this reflects, once again, demand for our earlier stage assets. We see phase 3 assets, phase 3 royalty rates being double than that of phase 2. And this, to me, represents the uncertainty and risk you get in phase 2 versus phase 3. Another point to remember is that royalties are often tiered, with higher tiers reaching 25% or more for late phase assets. So looking at royalties by indication. So once again, for this chart on the left, I've got royalty rates. And I've broken the chart down into different indications, the different colors here. The median royalty rate across indications is 14%. And just to give you a flavor of some royalty rates in oncology, absent Exelixis 2016 last year, 26%. It was a strategic research collaboration to utilize small molecules. And then you had Teva Eagle 2 years ago, 20%. This was a license agreement for EP3102. It was for the treatment of CLL and B-cell NHL. And then Teva Eagle 2 years ago at 20% again. So roughly 20 to 26% for oncology based on this very limited data set. So now we have talked about trends in industry. We've talked about trends in licensing. We've also discussed a bit of M&A. So now we can talk about valuation concepts. Now, what are the features of biotech financing? So as I've mentioned, it's very expensive to run trials. There's a lot of time and effort involved. Time and effort means you need money. So a great deal of capital required before you even start generating revenues. Well-known fact for all of you, risk is high. High risk, high reward. And valuation depends on the portfolio. So what does this mean in practice? You often have angel investors that help to start the companies. Often you find that you run out of money sometimes, which means that you need multiple rounds of private financing. Series A, B, C, D. And the very specialist nature of the industry means that you need investors who understand the industry. People want to understand what's going on. Therefore, you need people who have the requisite knowledge before they start investing. They normally have typically early access to public capital before revenues are generated. I think we see that with a lot of companies here. The high-risk nature of the industry means that you have financing with downside protection in case something goes wrong. And you have return coming from capital growth rather than dividends. It doesn't make sense to pay dividends because companies would rather conserve cash to fund their trials which means that you get capital growth further down the road rather than paying dividends on a yearly basis to investors. So for this chart, if different company values are shown here for different companies in different rounds. So, for example, you'll see public companies trading 50 to 100% over private companies. So, for example, Series A, very early stage company, high risk. You're not really sure what the rewards are. Hence, 25 million. And you have a public company IPOing 800. So why this huge difference? The main reason for this difference is risk. As you get bigger, your risk of failure goes up. As you go public, when you go into the public markets, your marketability goes up. It's much easier to sell something on the stock market rather than selling shares in a private company. Now, in the stock market, your companies are valued on a continuous basis. Hence, they're perceived to be very liquid. Private companies are not. It takes time to do a valuation. It takes time to sell your share in a private company to someone else. So this is why you have a premium for a public company. Looking at valuation in private rounds. So this alludes to the previous slide, where you see an increase in values from Series A all the way to Series D. I mean, if you look at the numbers on this chart, on all four charts here, the numbers are very different, very different, and this varies greatly, and depends on the product type, the indications you're targeting, which stage you're at, and your business model. So these numbers can change depending on the type, depending on all these factors I just mentioned, which means that there are large variations that exist in the amount of capital raised per round. So from what I've seen, companies doing biologics, therapeutics, they are the higher end of this. They tend to receive higher valuations, while diagnostic and medical devices tend to have lower valuations. So, valuations at different stages for the US market. It's a very messy slide, but if we just focus on the numbers below, the takeaway is that when you have data, which is the third column here, that's a huge impact. So if you look at the phase 3 companies, this column here, you have a mean and median of 595 and 217. But when you have data, this goes up tremendously to 2,165, 1,225, in numbers obviously in millions. So a huge uplift. So we have talked about the financing market. Let's talk a bit about methods, valuation methods. So in general, there are 3 methods that we look at. DCF, which is discounted cash flow, trading comparables, and acquisition comparables. Note that multiples such as price earnings and price earnings to growth, you can't use this to value biotech in general. And the reason why is that, as I mentioned previously, some biotechs do not generate revenues, their earnings negative. When you have negative earnings, it is not viable to use the PE ratio. You get a negative PE ratio, which theoretically doesn't really make sense. But going back to the 3 methods, we have 3 methods: DCF, trading comparables, and acquisition comparables. Now, no one method is perfect. There are advantages and disadvantages to each method. And in reality, we use a combination of all 3 methods, and it's a process which we call value triangulation. So we get 3 different values from these 3 methods, and we will come to, and through many discussions, we will eventually settle on a valuation range. So the DCF valuation, the first one we'll start with. Essentially, discounted cash flow. So you're using cash flows, forecasted cash flows, and you're discounting them over time to arrive at a singular figure called the net present value. And we will see that later on as we progress through the presentation. There is a worked example which I prepared for everyone, and we will go through that. So it's typically used to establish valuation. Other methods are used as a sanity check. It is a very powerful method because when you forecast cash flows, there are a lot of things you need to consider. So it forces, and we call this bottom-up forecasting. You really need to think about what's going on when you make your projections. So for example, you need to think about how much am I going to sell? What's my profit margin? What are my costs? Am I going to spend any money on capital expenditure? What's my working capital? So you need to think through all these things. So it's a very powerful tool for forcing to think about what's required, about what's needed to come to a valuation. It's also in theory the most correct of all the methods because it is the most precise. But it doesn't mean that it's the most theoretically correct. It means that it's the best method. Because there's so many variables you can play around in a DCF. There is also a lot of room for error. And this means that it's also very, very difficult to get it right in practice. I've done many DCFs before, and you build it the same way. You have very different assumptions, and the values can change. It can change in the range of millions and billions. You know, it's very precision. Precision is a good thing, but it can also be a very, very bad thing. And the problem about this is that you're trying to build a forecast of cash flows that look into the future. And as you go further out into the future, you start to run into difficulties about how the future may look like. So going back to how we do it. So we have DCF. We value the drugs independently, and then we add them together. We then add corporate costs in, which are negative. And typically, we'll give no value to platform technology for a company that has a mid or late stage pipeline. So this is the first method. The second method, comparables. So let's say you're looking at TTY Biopharm shares, and you're asked, how much do you think they're worth? You could do a DCF, by looking at, you could do a DCF forecast, but that will take you a very long time. So a quick way would be to use multiples, and think of multiples as something which is quick, something which is something that the market is telling you. I would think of multiples as an example when you're buying a house. So when you buy a house, hopefully you'll do two things. You look at how much it has sold on a per square foot basis, and you also look at how much perhaps the house closest to the house you're trying to buy sold for. So there are many multiples that we can use, all with their advantages and disadvantages. So you have the price earnings per share, which is PE. You have price to sales per share, price to sales. You have enterprise value over sales and enterprise value over EBITDA. So on the next page, let's go through an example as to how we can calculate the PE ratio, price over earnings per share, for TTY Biopharm. So I've got a Bloomberg screenshot here. And I've got my price on the top left-hand corner of 113 Taiwanese dollars and 50 cents. I've got my earnings per share on the bottom right of $6.29. So I have these two variables. When I divide them, price over earnings per share, it gives me a PE ratio of 18.04. So you can actually do this yourself at home. You can type in the ticker, go to Bloomberg, and calculate PE ratios. Now, I've shown you how to calculate PE ratios for one company, but what if you have many PE ratios for different companies? What does it all mean? So this is a chart showing the price earnings ratio for different companies over time. So I started in 2005, and you plot all the PE ratios for different companies over 5 years. So my data set ends in Q2 2010. The different colors represent different companies. And I have a very nice looking chart here, but what is this telling me? So I see that if you look at the graph very simplistically, you can tell that they're all trending in relatively the same direction, except for the black colored line. So something is telling me, 2007 for this particular company, something went wrong here. I'll need to investigate what's going on. So you can use multiples, just as price earnings per share, to look at relative performance. But when you carry out a relative performance exercise, what are you comparing against to? So it is very important that you select the right peer group. You want to be comparing yourself to the correct benchmark. So for example, if let's say you're making US $100 million in revenues every year, you're not going to compare yourself to a company that's making $100 billion in revenues every year. The scale, the type of business will be very different. So in general, what we do to select a good peer group would be a number of factors, mainly, and we can divide them into two categories: operational and financial. So operational filters: portfolio. How many drugs do I have in my portfolio? Are they late stage or early stage? What indications am I doing versus my competitors? What's my lead product status, which leads back to the first point I was making? What stage of development? What's the commercialization potential? Is it a very specialized? Is it a very niche area I'm looking at? What's the type of business I'm looking at? Is it devices, services? Is it pure pharma? Is it manufacturing? Within each business model, there are different segments. So you need to pick your peers very carefully. And let's not forget the financial filters. You have size, market cap, revenues. Back to my example about generating $100 million in revenues versus another company with $100 billion in revenues. You have profit margins, leverage, which is the amount of debt you have, and your shareholder base. So a good example of one of the companies that we look at is Pharma Engine, and in our opinion, based on the filters that we have applied, this would be a good peer group for Pharma Engine. And many companies will have different opinions as to what the peer group would be, but based on what we think are the best comparables, this would be the selected peer group. It's not a science. It's more of an art. If you pick these companies based on judgment, what you think are the best filters that you should apply, and then you pick your comparables. So a little bit more about choosing the right multiples. As I've mentioned, you need to choose the right multiples. So how do you do that? So you look at multiples being used by investment professionals. You can download research reports. Look at what multiples they're using. These reports are easily available. You can get them off broker websites. You can take a look at the multiples they're using. And while you may have access to information and you may know what the multiples are, you must also understand why they're using certain multiples. There's no correct valuation multiple. Different multiples are used for different reasons. So as I mentioned, what happens if you have negative earnings per share? Can you use your price to earnings per share? No. So every multiple has their own use in the process of valuation. So just to illustrate my point about negative earnings per share, so this is OBI, another well-known company. And when I downloaded the Bloomberg screenshot, they had negative earnings per share. Now, if you have negative earnings, it's difficult to use PE, price to earnings. And if you're not generating revenues, how do you calculate price to sales? So you need to understand why these metrics are being used, because you can't just blindly apply them to every company. Every company is going through a different situation. They have a different business model. So you need to understand how to apply them. Very important. And the last comparables that I'll talk about is transaction comparables. Same multiples as trading comparables. But the difference is value comparison. So when you look at the multiple on the Bloomberg page, this is assuming that you're buying a certain number of shares, but the number of shares you're buying is not large enough for you to control the business. Because if let's say I went out today and I bought, let's say, 10,000 shares in OBI Pharma, there's not much I can do to control the business. I would not have a say in what the company does. However, if let's say I bought the whole company tomorrow, I would effectively have control of the company, and that would let me make all the decisions on a day-to-day basis. So the difference with transaction comparables is this thing we call a control premium. It's the value that I get from being able to control the business rather than simply owning a very small percentage in it. And because of this control premium, you see that the numbers for this transaction comparables will be higher than what you get in trading comparables. Okay, I'll quickly pause here and take any questions.
Thank you very much for your valuable, data and insight shared with us. Zhao is wonderful, and he is the finance and business development analyst with ASLAN, and has been working with JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Temasek in Singapore. So very senior, and the data he shared with us is extremely valuable. And any questions from the floor? To Carl or to Zhao?
I couldn't really get your presentation very well because I couldn't figure out those colors on the book. So if possible, if we can give you our email address, if it's kind enough for you, please email at least some of the non-confidential parts to us. Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tina Zhao from Clarivate Analytics, and thank you for the presentation. May I ask a question about the deal evaluation? Because you mentioned about for the comparable deals, if there is only one criteria you will estimate your deals, what will be the priority about the comparing for the comparable deals, especially for the terms or other criteria in your deals?
Sorry, so just to understand your question, you're asking if I have a number of deals, how do I rank their importance?
You have many deals, right?
Yeah, we have many deals.
So the first, you may estimate by the deal size or by the therapeutic area or about a company. So in your presentation, you also mentioned about that if you for the comparable deals. So the first criteria for you for estimation, you will comparable for the company similar like you, or for the product, the pipeline on the drug on the pipeline, you'll be the similar as your drugs. So there are different criteria to define the comparable.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so about the comparable, what will be the first thing or your priority to mention or to think about the comparable? About the same product or the same company?
Oh, okay. You're asking whether we rank any factors. You're asking for a ranking of factors. As I said, it's more of an art than a science. So I think if you focus too much on one factor, you risk ignoring the rest, because deals are done for different reasons. So when we typically look at comparable deals, we tend to take a more wholesome approach. We tend to focus on most of the factors I've mentioned. We don't just look at one factor and zoom in on that.
Yeah, I mean, so Zhao is entirely right. It's very difficult to just focus on one, and it's all case specific. I think you'll find when people quote this sort of data, they typically focus on things like therapeutic area, stage of development, but also the type of company you're licensing from and licensing to. Ultimately, the primary determinant of how big a deal could be is going to be based on the value of the drug that's actually being partnered. And that makes it difficult because you could see a company that's partnering a phase 2 oncology compound and they get an upfront of, $5 million. That's actually very small for a phase 2 oncology deal. So how do you, and there are some deals that have been done in the industry where people pay upfronts of, one of the records is a deal with a company between Reata and Abbott, $500 million as an upfront payment. So how do you explain the difference? Fundamentally, it just comes down to the fact that the person who's willing to pay $500 million is paying it for a very, or drug that's likely to be very, very effective and have a very big market and great market potential. So it's to be honest, it's very difficult to say for certain, let's just look at other oncology phase 2 deals and that gives you a right number. So when all the data we show, we always look at averages. We look at means, we look at medians, just to give you a rough idea, and it's very good for comparing. But really the only way to drill down specifically, when we do licensing deals, and we'll be showing you a little bit later how we do this, is we build DCF models. We build these sort of models of valuation for the compound. We figure out when you do a licensing deal, how much of the value do I keep, how much do I give away, what's a fair value? And then you really are getting into specifics about sales potential, commercial potential, how big a drug is it?
I mean, after listening to Zhao's sharing, I would suggest that the either Taipei Exchange or Taiwan Exchange to invite you to give a lecture to share, to let them know in depth about the trend of the features and the trend of those transaction business valuation, for them to more understand about the industry. Otherwise, still use the traditional P ratio and the dividend to see the performance of this industry, which is very,
I think you're right. I think traditional biotech is so different from traditional industries, and I think the interesting observation about Taiwan is biotech has to an extent come out of the fact that Taiwan was a very strong drug manufacturer. Taiwan has a very long history making drugs and doing a great job. And in a manufacturing context, you look at things like sales, profitability, turnover, lots of very standard metrics for a company. As soon as you get into biotech, you don't. I'll give you one example. So there's a company that called Tesaro. It's a US listed company. Now, the company last year had a market cap of $2 billion, $2 billion US. The company has no drugs approved, or last year rather, it had no drugs approved. It was just had a drug that was in phase 3, hadn't finished phase 3 even. $2 billion, zero sales. Hadn't done any significant licensing deals. This year, the company has just launched a drug, and they've just launched it. So still today, well, certainly recently, no sales being generated. The market cap is now $8 billion. So you can have companies with $10 billion in the US that haven't generated a single dollar of revenue. And that makes it such a different industry from any others that I think most of our investors and our stakeholders are used to working with.
Okay, thank you for your joining. Thank you.